about America and democracy. There is no America. There is no democracy. We no longer live in a world of nations and ideologies. The world is a college of corporations, inexorably determined by the immutable bylaws of business. The world is a business. And I have chosen you to preach this evangel.
For all my free market healthcare robbing, stock stealing, retirement fund fucking with niggas. Fuck you little credit card scamming, jewelry stealing, crack selling, liquor store robbing motherfuckers. Shout to the homies, Carnegie, OG, Willie Randolph Hearst, Baruch, Rockefeller, the real Rockefeller, my main bitch Leona, pour out a little Louis the 13th. Scott Rothstein, Jack Abramoff, hold your head. My road shop niggas, let's get this money. I spend my day pepping America overseas. Pension for the workers, nigga, please. Embezzlement, etiquette, private settlement. I'm better with Confederate rhetoric from my mansion in Connecticut. Foreclose of it, close out the tenement. I twist words like a speech impediment. I hope you got good credit, bitch. If not, better get a new job with benefits. While I play golf with niggas to get cheddar with. New money buys brand new carrots. My old money bunch of great grandparents. You got grills in your mouth, I ain't mad at you. I own every gold mine in South Africa. Thanks, baby, you made me $1 billion. Plus, I own a building.
Welcome, everybody, to Voice of Rebellion Radio. This is your host, Chris J. On Friday afternoon here on the East Coast. Still earlier afternoon over on the West Coast tonight. You're so used to saying tonight. I think that last week I went live, actually, on Sunday night. So, I was saying tonight. But this afternoon, we'll have Dakotah Lilly on here at Voice of Gun Radio. He recently traveled to Venezuela and met with President Maduro and his First Lady and multiple other revolutionaries there. So he'll be telling us a little bit of some stories of that trip. He also went on Fox News famously, I guess you could say, and on they actually put, I remember they put on Fox News, like, that clip on their Facebook feed, like, trying to say, like, oh, look at this, it's like along the lines of, like, oh, look what these millennials believe. But the thing is, you actually hear him out and hear what he says about Venezuela. Ultimately, Tucker Carlson had no good response to many of the things that Dakotah was saying. Ultimately, he just tried to put more cliche, mainstream lines of propaganda we're so used to hearing from the media when it comes to Venezuela and also multiple other countries that they have these strong propaganda against. You have you've had the same lies against Iran a couple of years ago when you had Israel. It was trying to provoke the war with Iran, and, kept talking about how they were 6 months away from the nuclear weapon. That lie has been spread for 30 years. There's some multiple lies that are being pushed by the media against Venezuela right now. And, ultimately, what does Iran and Venezuela have in common? They're both strong Russian allies that have a lot of petroleum under their territory. Also, another thing is they're both two countries that kicked out the Rothschild Central Bank. So you have these two common denominators, but they'll try to tell you it's about democracy, but those countries are undemocratic and don't have any freedom. But ultimately, you look at the two situations in both countries, is that the Bolivarian government of Venezuela actually has elections that are very legitimate and are internationally recognized as being legitimate. Even the Carter Institute, and what interest does really the Carter Institute have in calling the Bolivarian process legitimate? They don't, that I can see. And Iran's elections, they do have elections. They just held elections in May. And Rouhani won again the elections. It's true that it is semi-obstructed to be a totally open election by the fact that there is the supreme leader and they have the religious body that kind of like pre-screens the candidates prior to see if they're even morally sound to their standards to be president, or whether it be disastrous presidency or may detrimental to the country if they by some way snuck into the presidency. For example, even though I disagree with this decision by the supreme leader and the governing body of Iran, when Mahmoud Ahmadinejad wanted to give another crack at it, he wanted to run against it. I think it would have been pretty beneficial for the country, but I also see their point of view is that he was kind of polarizing, and maybe they don't want to go down a very they don't want a hardliner in the Iranian government this time. How I see the hardliner would be necessary, and I'm against the idea of like reforming. Kind of like I see it's a dangerous path that ultimately opens yourself up to being totally co-opted in the end. But when it comes to Iran and Venezuela, the lies are similar in the mainstream media, and very few have the courage to go right to their face, go to Fox News or MSNBC or whatever mainstream outlet and actually challenge it. Well, right now we have our caller, Dakotah Lilly, our guest for the day, has just called in, so I'm going to let him into the studio right now and see. Hey, Dakotah, can you hear me?
Yep. Can you hear me?
Yep. Welcome. You're live. Glad to have you on such short notice, but yeah, it's great to have you on the show. And I'll just open up talking about how cool it was that you actually were able to go on Fox News and directly challenge one of these talking heads that they call themselves a journalist. I really cringe at even saying the word journalist for most of these people in the media. I don't think there's one that really qualifies them as a journalist. But
yeah,
whatever you
definitely
want.
Not.
You challenged them face to face, which is practically like a dream for me to actually go. Maybe not Tucker Carlson. He's not really the one that's drawn a lot of angst from me, I guess, directly. I love to go like on the Wolf Blitzer show and just destroy him when he goes on his tirades about Russia influencing the elections, or him, most of CNN, and also Rachel Maddow. I don't really fancy her because Russia's everywhere to her. Russia order at McDonald's. It's it's a little bit ridiculous and it's painful to watch her show. But I'm going to open up the show by just asking, because I couldn't imagine my reaction if I was sitting next to President Maduro. Any world leader in general would be quite an experience. Some the negative one. This would be a rather positive one, I think, for me. But were you any bit like nervous actually meeting a head of state? Or were just so stoked that I guess all that nerves chilled when you got to be next to Maduro? Or I don't know, what was the feeling when you actually saw him with your own eyes in front of you?
I arrived at this rally. It started out as a march, and then it turned into a rally in front of the presidential palace. And some of the people from his team came up to me while we were all getting seated. People are cheering and everything. And they said, "We want you to make a speech. The president will introduce you." And so obviously I was super nervous, and they took me right up to the front row, the very first seat in front of him. I was seated next to the Minister for Gender and Women's Equality. So I got a picture with her, and the president and the first lady, Celia Flores, came out, and I took some pictures. I waved at them. They waved back. They smiled and everything. It was a really great speech. He alluded to a lot of really important things. Thank God there was some translation because I don't speak Spanish. And it was just really great. I never got called up to speak, though. I guess they were short on time because some other person that went on before Maduro, I guess, went a little long. So I wasn't able to actually go up and speak, but it didn't make the experience any less special or any less amazing. It was really, really, really great. And there were so many people there, At the end, when he was done speaking, all these children were running up to give him gifts and presents, and women and men alike were yelling at the first fighter and the president and everything. And it made me think, in the United States, we have, such armed security that would, never happen. People would be gunned down before they got anywhere close to the president. And, because they're so hated. But in Venezuela, children and everyone were just rushing to get a chance to meet him, get a chance to give him cards and everything. So it was a really, really amazing experience.
Yeah, I couldn't even imagine. You have to be like, they have like pretty much like quarantine zones around our president when they go anywhere within like a mile. They have security. They have snipers everywhere. It's ridiculous. And the reason for that is that they know that their system is despised by many, and by having even though he might not be the one at the helm of the system, he's ultimately, in my point of view, more of a figurehead. He's more of a spokesman than anything, the president of the United States. The amount of power that people believe he has is exaggerated. It's ultimately a lot of people that you don't even see on television are calling a lot of shots here. But, Trump was, if somebody was rushing at Trump, he would be gunned down in a second. So they would automatically assume it was an assassin of some sort. In Venezuela, I've seen that before Chavez, that, people would come up and, run up to his Jeep when he would come into different rural villages across the country. That's another thing that, it's pretty atypical of heads of state in the West, is that them taking interest in these people that don't have necessarily a lot of sway in perhaps their own elections, or really have much of these are people that in Venezuela, they're way out in the rural areas, towns of a few thousand, I believe Chavez would visit at times. So I'm going to go on to another thing then, is that according to polls that we've been told on our media and all over the internet, talk about the unpopularity of Nicolas Maduro, that he's nowhere compared to Hugo Chavez. Do you believe that these polls are accurate, saying that he only has perhaps somewhere between 20 to 30% of the population in approval of him, or do you think it's much more and that they're tweaking the numbers?
I think polls in general are very politicized. It's very easy. If you go into certain parts of Caracas, the capital city of Venezuela, and you ask, you could ask 10,000 people in one part of this, they would all hate Maduro because it's a wealthy, upper class, ritzy area. But, that's obviously not representative of the entire electorate or the population. I saw so many people that just loved him. I saw gift shops filled with pictures of him and graffiti across the city, admiring him and acknowledging the Constituent Assembly and Chavez and Bolivarianism and PSUV and everything. I don't think, obviously he's a very divisive person. The Bolivarian Revolution is very divisive in general, and that's bound to happen when you challenge the establishment and you challenge the oligarchs and the imperialists. And I do think there's obviously a sector of Venezuelan society that does despise Maduro and does despise the progress that's being made. But I think they despise it because their wealth, their influence, and their oligarchy has been challenged and the power has been stripped away from them, given to the people. I think if you look at the voter turnout for the Constituent Assembly elections a few months back, there was 8 million people that crossed rivers and ravines and opposition violence in order to vote for this assembly called by President Maduro. I think support much higher than our media allows, and I think even the polls allow to be showed.
Yeah, I saw that. They actually had one of the biggest turnouts ever in their history with the Constituent Assembly vote in late July. I believe over 8 million Venezuelans voted for that Constituent Assembly, which they tried to, immediately our media went jumping to saying this is officially like a declaration of a dictatorship by the government, so it's a fraudulent vote. Pretty much all the typical lines the mainstream media loves to push, and it's very much the same between, all the multiple different countries that are right now under the gun of United States, Israeli, the Western circle of imperialism. And, you look at Iran right now, it's really to compare, Iran, they say the same thing about their elections, is that they're not legitimate. And I did explain when the show first started, is that it's true that they have a governing body, a religious body that kind of oversees, make sure certain candidates don't get in. It's more, but it's not so much it's about how they see the well-being of the country. It's like they didn't allow Ahmadinejad in because right now they're trying to go down a more reforming peace way. They don't really want a hardliner like Ahmadinejad, which, like I said, I disagree. I think perhaps a hardliner is really what you need in desperate times like right now. I believe the American war machine is getting meaner. It's getting more fierce, and you see that it's kind of like presidents are kind of they're not really have a lot of power, but they reflect the current state of what the people at the top think. And right now, I think the people at the top are starting to get a little bit wild and are not really sure what they're going to do because the petrodollar, because their schemes are starting to get recognized, and people are starting to, countries are now backing away. You have major governments like Russia that are dumping the dollar, Venezuela dumping the dollar. And soon, and the thing is, our dollar is all reliant on people trading in our dollar. So if everyone dumps it, our dollar will be worthless, and it'll reap massive consequences to their entire system. It might actually just come crumbling down, a multi-step catastrophe that would be for them. And it would be really a rough time for everybody at first, but I think in the end we'd probably be better off. But Venezuela, I think that why they went so harsh against Venezuela, it really has to do with monetary concerns. It's about them dumping the dollar. It's about them no longer playing with interests such as the Rothschild family and other elite families that are, like I said, these people are not on television. These people are not even listed by Forbes, but these are the people sway over how things go on in the West. You said about, there's like a sector, and I know I've heard that like mostly Venezuelans don't really support the Bolivarian government. But do you think there's like an exception to that? Do you think it's like overwhelmingly, because they say it's like half and half. At one point they were saying like all the people that poor support the Bolivarian government and the people that are richer don't. Now I'm going to play devil's advocate here and just want to hear your response. Do you think that perhaps the richer people, because they're better educated and they believe that more prosperity will come from a different system is why they support it, or you really believe it's just pure greed, pure trying to hold on to the system that's made them rich, which is the prior system, Chavista, like the 90s, 80s system.
I think it's greed. I mean, if you look at things were before Chavez, I mean, the nation was not prosperous. The nation was not. It had terrible poverty rates, illiteracy rates, unemployment rates, inflation rates. Things were terrible for common people. Things were terrible for working people. But things were, again, good for the rich, the oligarchy, the squalid. I don't think they have our interests in mind. I don't think they have anyone's interest in mind besides themselves and their own class. I think if you look at many Latin American examples of neoliberalism and free market ideas, not once has it brought prosperity to the people or prosperity to really any sector of the country besides the oligarchy. I mean, after Salvador Allende was murdered in a CIA-backed coup in Chile, right-wing fascist dictator Augusto Pinochet was installed by the CIA, and he instituted free market neoliberal capitalist reform, and it was terrible for the people. Things were terrible. Wages fell, unemployment rose, inflation went up. People couldn't afford basic goods. People couldn't afford housing. If you look at the same thing in Venezuela, that's how it was before Chavez. If you look at how it is in Colombia, which has never, or at least not in recent years, turned to the left, that's how it is in Colombia. If you look at Brazil, things were good under Lula and to a lesser extent Dilma, but before that, neoliberalism reigned supreme and the people didn't have an economy that worked for them. What these people want, they want to go back to a system where they hold the power. They want to go back to a system where they are the dominant class. And their time is just up, and I think they know that, and I think that's why this axis of resistance, Iran, Venezuela, the DPRK, Syria, Bolivia, Cuba, all these countries get so demonized and attacked is because they show that there's an alternative way, and every country should have the right to have its own destiny and its own notion of sovereignty.
Now, yeah, I know. I'll say right there about Colombia that I don't think they've ever had a left-wing government of any sort, because I have my family, on my mom's side is from Colombia, so, and that's like 95% of my family, because they're way bigger than my American family. But yeah, they don't. It's bad there. They have a lot of problems with poverty. They have people that make $120 a month, which those people, how they make it is usually they're like almost like slaves to richer people that are. They often live in somebody else's house and are like a maid or some kind of servant. There's a lot of there's a lot of problems with their food prices. They've skyrocketed inflation. Everything's being privatized practically now. There was a big scandal about 2 years ago about the privatization of some state properties, and this is pretty much about it's going on right now. But it seems like there's a tide turning. A lot of people are being, I think, a little bit more tired of the status quo, but at the same time, it's also erupted a war from the right, and they believe that they can challenge the status quo with their own, version of, I guess, change, which, the far right of Colombia has gotten louder, and they kind of rally around Uribe. Santos kind of represents the center right, but they're not really like, a lot of the Uribes find, like, they think Santos is secretly communist, kind of like how, some of the ultra-right people in the United States believe that Obama was a communist. It's kind of like the same thing in Colombia with Santos, is that they believe because he wanted to do the FARC deal, they believe he's a communist in secret, and that he's secretly working with the Venezuelan and Cuban government or something like that. I shit you not, that's how it is. But
and to talk about Colombia quickly, I think it's important that while the United States and a lot of these countries condemn Venezuela for so-called human rights abuses, and I even heard drug trafficking charges being levied against Venezuela, which I think is ridiculous considering the United States' biggest ally in Latin America is Colombia, which is damn near a narco state at this point. In Colombia, people get shot for having left-wing views. In Venezuela, the opposition is setting Chavistas on fire alive. So for the United States, and the United States itself also is no beacon of human rights by any means. So for the United States to talk about human rights and democracy and these things that they simply don't care about, and certainly show that they don't care about in their policies with other countries and domestically, it's just ridiculous.
Yeah, it's absurd. And, I can tell you with Colombia is that ultimately, the thing is they put it on giant facade like Mexico does, is that they're, fighting the drug traffickers, that the government is actively searching these people down. But ultimately, they've been in a loose collaboration with them for a long time, and have a direct collaboration that people are starting to acknowledge finally in Colombia with the paramilitaries. And the paramilitaries pretty much do the work of the government that would look too bad in the press to have been done by the government. So, like assassinations of community organizers, assassinations of activists, that kind of thing, really dirty stuff. Sometimes just mass murder. I believe they've committed at different times in Colombian history. And there's so much criminal organization. It's like a criminal hotbed in Colombia, because they know that the government doesn't really do much to stop these people. They don't stop you until you start challenging their system, until you become a left-wing, even just a non-violent left-wing activist. And practically all the thing is that they also love to associate the political left in Colombia. A lot of the far-righters love to associate that and the political left across South America with the guerrillas such as FARC and such, but ultimately, political left in Colombia does not support FARC. Chavez, evidence they supported FARC. It's true that Cuba and the Soviet Union supported FARC prior to 1991. However, FARC's kind of evolved since then. Now they're more just kind of they're more of a drug trafficking organization that kind of doesn't really have much of an ideology at this point. Maybe perhaps in the past. I don't know too much about them. I know more about because I more focused on the political left and the different politics in Colombia. But I can tell you pretty much it's like a giant coalition that it involves every party but one socialist party called alternative Democratic poll is the only one that is outside the coalition and challenges the government. But they have like 8 parties, and they make it seem like they're battling each other, but ultimately they're like, oh yeah, but we're a coalition together. Ultimately, you have like people from all the way from the far right all the way to supposedly a socialist party in quotations. The Liberal Party is in quotation socialist, but it's more they are social democrats, what they call themselves, but they're socialist international. Talk about Venezuela. It's funny because I was going to bring that up at one point. You said about the drug trafficking charges that were brought against Maduro's children, right? It was against was it children that he had with, or was it Celia Flores' first lady's children? I'm not sure if they were like, she brought them in from a prior marriage or something like that. But I know they were like really closely connected to the Venezuelan government. Is what they were saying. The DEA arrested them, I believe, in Haiti back in 2015. So here's the thing I'll have to ask you, is that you don't think that perhaps maybe the Venezuelan government has steeped to maybe kind of seedy means in order to try to pay because of their desperate situation? I mean, politics is a pretty dirty game, and sometimes when countries seem to be doing, they might be doing just about everything else, right, or might have good intentions, but ultimately politics will have you resort to sometimes, what we consider seedy means, such as drug trafficking. Do you believe that could have happened? And do you think there's any real evidence that actually shows that the Venezuelan government has been involved with drug trafficking?
Well, I definitely think there's no evidence of that. I think if you look at, the fight against drug trafficking has actually intensified under the last few years of the Maduro administration. The last Attorney General, I believe it was, was one of the most prolific drug trafficking fighters in recent memory. I think it's being used as a political weapon, much as human rights and other things are, because, they use terms like these, things that people can't really be against. No one is against fighting drug trafficking. No one is against human rights or democracy or anything like that. But they use it as a pretext for intervention. They use it as a pretext for more imperialism and more interference in other countries' affairs. Again, if the United States actually cared about any sort of fighting drug trafficking or anything like that, they should go after their own CIA and FBI, as well as their allies in the Mexican government, in the Colombian government. It's, again, complete hypocrisy. And the countries that have been most committed to fighting drug trafficking end up being Venezuela and Uruguay and other countries that have been headed by left-wing governments over the past few years.
Yeah, it's a major hypocrisy. They talk about this, and we're talking about this like the same week that movie, I think it's next Friday, comes out, a movie about Barry Seal, the guy that worked at the DEA, the CIA, and Pablo Escobar, all at the same time in the 1980s. They're releasing a Hollywood movie, believe it or not. It's like coming out in the open about Barry Seal, and there's all these multiple, figures that were involved with both the United States government and the cartel in Colombia. And all throughout the 80s, America was really involved with the cocaine trafficking through Contras, and now it seems like they're finally. I think they're almost like trying to get the population to say, oh yeah, we did some bad stuff back then, but we don't do it anymore. Just forgive us. It's kind of like the mentality they're trying to push with it. Why they're even leaking it out there. Like, oh yeah, see, we're honest. When we're wrong, that kind of thing. But ultimately, they're still doing it. They're still doing it with the drug cartels down in Mexico, and ultimately, they're not creeping into the United States. And that's why part of the reason. It's part of the reason why we're having a heroin epidemic in this country is because of the Mexican cartel's influence, and also because America went into Afghanistan, and now they have 5,000% more poppy production than they had in 2000 when it was banned, and actually 3/4 of the world's opium was off the market when it got banned. They tolerated the Taliban and all the other brutal stuff that they did to the public population until that happened. That was the thing that ultimately crossed the line. All of a sudden, then they were terrorist supporters and many other things that they and some of the stuff they said was true. They just finally put it out there when it became convenient for them to do so. When you were down there in Venezuela, did you see any, did it seem like normal life? Did it not seem like a dictatorship? I guess is the best way to explain, heavy police presence, a lot of surveillance, a lot of mistrust, that kind of thing. Did it actually seem normal when you were there?
I definitely didn't see any signs of dictatorship. There was, again, it's important to note that these protests that have been going on in Venezuela have been so violent and so prolific in their violence. Like I said, Chavistas have been burned alive. People have died. Many Chavistas have died. These billions of dollars of property damage. So again, these protests have actually mostly subsided, and I think there is certainly no surveillance or anything like that. I think they have police forces just like everywhere else has police forces. I think they have a military just like everywhere else has a military. I went to many shops, many cafes, many delis, and there was food. I've seen grocery stores that appeared to have food on the shelves. Shortages, scarcity is certainly a problem, but I don't think it's as deep-seated as the mainstream media likes it to seem. I think the government recently took a lot of actions against it, and I think that it certainly helped. The only time I ever saw something that rang true was there were very long lines at banks, at ATMs, because there is a shortage of cash for many, many reasons. But life, has more or less continued, not normally, because there is an economic war going on against the country, and things are far from, perfect. But the government, with the CLAP initiative, where the government and local communities provide basic staples of food per month, is important. I think it's helped the problems of scarcity and of the economic war. I think dropping the dollar from auction houses and from the trading in dollars for oil was very, very a good move. I think things economically are starting to recover a bit. I think because the Venezuelan government recently instituted 8 new laws that I think are helping, although I just learned right before this call that Canada, the Canadian government, recently just put sanctions on Venezuela, as well as the United States. Well, as well as, the United States already had sanctions on. And again, those are not helping either, any of the situations. Certain things that need to be imported, certain food items, certain medicines, etc., are being made worse by these economic sanctions and this embargo being placed upon them. It's almost like, it reminds me very much so of what they did to Salvador Allende, this campaign of economic sabotage and war, and as well as at the same time financing opposition groups in Venezuela. I think, not once has socialism been able to rise or fall by its own merits. Never once has it been able to operate outside the confines of imperialism and sabotage by world powers. And Venezuela is no exception.
Well, that seems a little different than what they've tried to tell us, especially on different, Fox News. They try to make it seem like it's apocalyptic and people, I was going to say, you didn't see anybody shank somebody with a spork over the last potato or anything like that, but it doesn't sound like it from what you told me, but that's what they're trying to push on Fox News, that it's just like there is no food there is no, the money's absolutely worthless, people are dying and stuff like that, and a lot of people are going hungry, and, they show pictures. I don't know, were you able to, maybe perhaps, this is one thing I found disturbing if true, I didn't think it was true, it was just all the other propaganda. I don't believe really anything the mainstream media pushes about Venezuela, or, people, a lot of the other propaganda. If you're on Facebook a lot, you're going to see people that are, they become their own journalists, I guess you can say. and they push their own thing. And I've seen people of more of the free market supporters, the strong ANCAPs, anarcho-capitalists and such. They post pictures of Venezuela where it looked like this absolutely filthy building that they were in. They didn't look like they had barely any medical supplies, and they were saying a caption in Venezuela people are so poor that that there's so little supplies that they have to go buy supplies from other countries. Were you able to hear anything about that, about the medical situation? That's pretty important if it's absolutely true. And they try to say the same thing about Cuba. I've seen people, especially, I think I've seen it from defectors, in different articles, look through the comments. I was I'm from Cuba, or no, they'll usually say my mom lives in Cuba and they don't. I have to buy her medicines for her whatever treatment. Did you see anything of that nature? I don't know if you happen to have seen a hospital nearby and saw anything ridiculous like that, but.
Well, what I know is under the Bolivarian government, obviously medical care was made free under certain social missions. New hospitals were built, new medicines were discovered. There was a huge effort between the Venezuelan government and the Cuban government to provide medical care to people. People were offered dental for the first time in their lives. It was, a really, really good thing. And again, because of the way patents work and the way the productive forces of the world work currently, it's almost impossible for Venezuela to produce their own of certain medicines. And certain medicines are in short supply because of, again, this entire campaign against Venezuela. These sanctions are hurting the Venezuelan people. The sanctions are hurting, the people that need help the most. And the Venezuelan government isn't able to help as much as they'd like to because of the sanctions and the economic war. And I mean, in Cuba, for example, Cuba has certain scarcities, again, only because of the economic blockade that the United States places on them. The Cuban healthcare is some of the best in the world. There's Americans and Canadians that leave their countries and go to Cuba for medical care because they can't afford medical care in their own country, and they can get care that's better or just as good in Cuba for free. So again, obviously I think there's some problems, but I don't think it's possible to separate it from the economic war that's being waged on Venezuela.
But do you think that there's anything absurd going on? I would get, there's different medicines that we've seen with Mark Shkreli, or I believe that was the guy's name, the guy that brought the EpiPen price to $700. That's very easy for medicine to go short because often they're made by one manufacturer, and in that case, others came about. And I think there might have been, at that time, though, I think it was a big deal, right? There was one manufacturer of that for people that have allergic reactions. And, so even in a country a first world country like the United States, even though I feel weird even calling America sometimes a first world country when I see so much poverty and there's other things that really shouldn't happen in a so-called first world country. But in the United States, we have sometimes, medicines can go short. So that doesn't really say anything if a few medicines go short because of stuff like that, patenting and the corporations refusing to do shipments to that country and such. But it's a different story if people are, for example, in hospitals that are not suitable for people that are trying to recover. You have people that are like what this picture showed. It looked like it looked like a filthy motel room or something like that. It was very little even medical equipment seemed to be anywhere nearby. And it was a pretty harsh image, but I know that ultimately there was no way of really fact-checking that besides what the guy said on there, because I could have done a reverse image search, I guess, but it may have come up with it might probably would have said, oh yeah, that's actually Colombia. Or, no, that was actually Guatemala or something, which probably was, actually, knowing the sad state of some of these countries in Central America that are still under American influence, like Guatemala or Honduras. Do you think anything like that's going on, where it's like total, incompetence by the system to provide these people basic services?
No. I mean, I talked to people in my delegation that have gone to hospitals and the doctors to get attention for their problems. They've gone to both American and Venezuelan hospitals, and the equipment has been the same. The hospitals have been largely the same, and there has been no problem. People actually got better diagnosis. I talked to people who actually got better diagnosis in Venezuela than they did in the United States.
Again, hospital, you talk about like the tourist use, because sometimes they have like a tourist and then they have like a one where everybody that's on the free health care uses.
Well, the people that I talked to had lived in Venezuela for years, and they were residents of Venezuela when they had to seek this medical attention. But they had such long-term problems that when they moved to the United States as well, or when they visited the United States as well, they had to go for the same problem. And they said, to every person I talked to, they said the was just as reliable and just as modern as in the United States.
Yeah, I believe that it wasn't like I really bought that image or the few. I've seen a couple actually. I think of like, because often like sometimes you see like people, they make like those little like pictures like, oh, this is your hospital on socialism. This, and then like your politician on socialism, they show like a mansion looks like the Mar-a-Lago or something like that, like trying to show that people like Maduro or Kirchner, they live like a luxury while the rest live in poverty. It's a line that people that are the hardcore anti-socialists love to push. But ultimately, you look at the countries that have not adopted, in quotation, socialism, like in Guatemala and Colombia, that's exactly the case, is that people live in subpar conditions in many places. That if you're in those rural villages in Colombia, it's not that best existence, while your politicians, people like Santos, they're definitely living in a giant mansion and living the good life, while most of their country suffers. Colombia has, I think, 29% of the population in abstract poverty. These people struggle to feed themselves, and America does not talk about the human rights problems or the poverty problems.
And I mean, if one looks at photographic evidence like that, it's so easy to manipulate it. I mean, there was a picture going around supposedly showing empty shelves in Venezuela and being to get their hands on goods, and people visibly upset at the fact that the shelf was empty. But it was later turned out that this image was actually a grocery store in New York. So it's very easy just to take a image and say this is what it is without, because there's no way to check things like that. And that's why evidence like that, I just don't take very seriously.
Yeah, I remember that, and I remember it was exactly that, New York City grocery store. I wonder how many people, there's probably news just circulating around the internet right now about Venezuela's, food scarcity problems, and they're probably showing like empty shelves. And, they're probably pictures from Florida during Hurricane Irma, because I saw that firsthand. I was like, I think it came across my mind. I wonder if someone's going to take a picture of this and like say this is Venezuela or something like that, because, ultimately also empty shelves don't mean anything to me, because, it could be stock day, it could be, actually an example like, a big natural event, where people are stocking up, like a hurricane, even though Venezuela doesn't get hurricanes too much, but they have other things that happen. It was a pretty lame propaganda, and a lot of people fell for it. It shows how quickly people are quick to believe stuff about countries like Venezuela or Iran because their media has, put that over and over again. And people that even say they are hip to the government being liars, they still believe everything practically about Venezuela, everything about Iran a lot of times, or they believe everything about Korea and all these. The only country that seems like has finally had a mass awakening that made a lot of the stuff we're being told about Syria, is I feel pretty much universally through people that are any bit about what the government is doing. They are starting to realize that the Syrian rebels we were lied to about, and I would say it's more because even mainstream TV personalities and such in America, and even at one point Donald Trump was talking about his mistrust for the Syrian rebels. That's the only reason I really think that there's a more widespread mistrust in the Syrian rebels. It's not really because they've researched that one subject unfortunately, a lot of what people are going to believe comes straight from television, the programming. They call it programming for a reason. Programming their view of the world on you. And everybody's going to believe of this axis of evil. Most of Americans, I think, generally believe that. That Iran, North Korea, these countries are there to destroy us pretty much, and that they're building nuclear weapons, and North Korea is going to launch a nuclear weapon once they have the ability to do so. A lot of Americans are actually, I hear a lot of Americans, they're actually scared about this whole North Korea scenario. With Venezuela, it sucks where I live. I pay a little bit more consequences for if I openly say anything out in public about, I think that they're lying about Venezuela. The government actually has done a lot of good for their people. You know how much hate I'll get for it here in Florida because I live in, and I'll say the word, I live in Gusano Central. This is where all the Cubans that went to. This is where all the Venezuelans and such, a lot of them, not really this city. I live in St. Petersburg. So it's more, it's more Caucasian here, I guess you could say, but like Miami, it's almost all those people, all those Cubans, all those Venezuelans, and they're the harshest critics of the regime. These people celebrated, like when Castro died. Oh, some people here did too. They had I remember one of my coworkers who was Cuban was saying that he was going to go to a party after Fidel died. Like they were going to go to their Cuban American Society or whatever. They were going to have a party of some sort, and they're going to roast a pig and everything. And I held it back just because of the work and politics and work don't usually mix. So I just cringed and walked away and tried to forget about that ugly statement. But is it the same there? I don't know where you live at. If you have a lot of people from Latin America or people from Venezuela and Cuba, but if you were to say the same things I'm saying, would you get as harsh as criticism as you would get here? You say?
Oh, definitely. I mean, I go to a very expensive school in New York City that I'm only able to go to because I get tens of thousands of dollars in grant money. When I had mentioned that I was going to Venezuela or that I supported Maduro or the Bolivarian Revolution, people flipped out, and it was always the same story. My mom, knows someone whose aunt once met a girl who worked at a grocery store who once checked out a person who knows someone that couldn't get medicine one day, and that's supposed to be the height of political analysis coming from these people. I mean, again, these expats, there's a reason they're so conservative. After these revolutions, after the Cuban Revolution, after the Bolivarian Revolution in Venezuela, there was an exodus of the people that had lost their power. I mean, why would they stay? They're not wanted. They would go somewhere where, capitalism reigns supreme, where the oligarchy still has power. So, naturally, they chose the United States.
Well, and it was just very close. Talk about after 1960s Cuba, a lot of them went to Miami. And you see, Miami's political scene is disgusting. I mean, I see some of these people, sometimes I'll have to see Univision and and what they call news, Univision, and they'll have people like that. I can't think of her name. She's like in Congress, I think. She's been in the politics for 30 years. One Cuban lady, but I remember reading her father was one of the bodyguards of Fulgencio Batista, the former dictator of the country that killed tens of thousands of people, and that's a fact. And they had an entire secret police force just to eliminating people that were communists, which is ironic because Fulgencio Batista, when he got elected in 1940, was elected on a semi-socialist platform. So when he got, after he came to the United States, he came back in 1952 to do the military coup. He took a much harsher, more right-wing political stance, and pretty much he became a mafia state, as we all know. People like Lucky Luciano used to hang out there, and it pretty much was a direct collaboration between the mafia and the Cuban government until finally the revolutionaries were able to take back the country. Yeah, it's here I get a little bit more direct. It's not like, oh yeah, I knew a person who knew a person who knew somebody's cousin. No, it's usually like, oh yeah, my aunt still lives down in Cuba, whatever. And I remember it was really rough because my political stance got out in high school. Eventually I stopped giving a shit, and I just said it anywhere. And I'm kind of not, I'll be reserved and try to play polite, and everything until 7 a.m. I get coffee. I'm sitting in class. Then I'm a little bit different person, and that was where my Spanish class was in. And it was ironic too that all these people were Hispanic, and were just there to get the credit. I'm pretty sure because they all spoke Spanish, including myself. But my teacher was Cuban. There was a couple Cubans in that class, and then it came out that I was supported Chavez, and there was just like tension. I could, it wasn't really like anybody really said much about it, but I just, I could feel it, like they knew, and she knew because slowly, I think that she realized that she started to like despise me a little bit because I made it pretty obvious. A lot of the people that were in that class had me on Facebook. They saw what I was talking about. So it's weird is that people will, like, people that before, like that teacher and a lot of the students in there liked me. But when they saw my politics, I could tell that they didn't want anything to do with me. I don't know if it was out of fear, whether it was out of just, potentially, I think, a little bit of hatred. That's how harsh they believe. I remember, it's funny, too, is that the people that have all these political opinions and stuff, like I remember this one girl talking about, Chavez is such an asshole. I'm like, yeah, well, you really don't know. You're, number one, you're from Mexico. Number two, you're sitting here in your $100 shirt, $150 jeans, sipping on an $8 Starbucks coffee. Probably shut the fuck up. you are the definition of the petite bourgeoisie, more like probably bourgeoisie in her case. Some of these people are like potential millionaires. Of course, you're going to believe that your parents are going to indoctrinate you into the system. Rarely, it's sad. That's how it is. That it's kind of rare to find people that are wealthier that can sort of sympathize with some of the people. And I feel like this with America. Is that a lot of times Americans have a hard time. People, Latin America, don't understand what it's like in the 90s in Venezuela. That's when people were jonesing for that potato, jonesing for a chicken leg or anything like that. Food was so damn expensive in 1989, 1990. The Andres Perez government. I remember Carrizaco erupted over food prices being too high where people couldn't afford. People started looting in order to survive, and then ultimately there's also protests started happening, and then they killed up to 3,000 of those guys, protesters, left-wing protesters in 1989. It's funny how they never mention that when they talk about the history of Venezuela. The biggest crime probably by the prior government under dictator Andres Perez. So I didn't really hear too many details about your trip to Venezuela, but how long did you ultimately stay there?
I got there on I was there 5 days in total.
Oh, it's almost a week. No, it's pretty decent. So when you were in Venezuela, they so often label the city as the most dangerous city in the world and the most violent city in the world. Did you have to be on total guard the entire time? I imagine you would, because there is a lot of, I know that they talk about, like, the tourists. Do you think that's just purely propaganda or, mostly propaganda? Like, I remember reading, like, one of those, it was a third-party page. It wasn't like CIA website, they have their travel section. But no, it was like a third-party page. I remember saying, oh, yeah, all travelers that go there, it pretty much was like you get robbed anywhere. You get robbed on the toilet, and they'll take your pants, pretty much. Pretty much everything short of that could happen. Was it really that intense when you were there? Like, you felt like somebody could pickpocket you at any second?
I mean, I, as an international delegate, and all the international delegates did have security because, it's the same if an international delegate comes to this country. They have really, really top-notch security. Like, in New York City for UN Week, there's police everywhere. It's just almost completely impossible to avoid. I'm sure that there are problems with crime. However, they are the government is actually doing something about it. They've instituted the Safe Homeland program, which has brought murder rates down in Caracas and across the country. They have the A Todo Vida social mission, which is trying to modernize the penitentiary system and the court system and provide more social protection. So it's not as if this is a problem that's being ignored. This is a problem that's, actually getting a lot of press and coverage in Venezuela, and is actually getting very appropriate responses from the government. I think, and again, a lot of it is blown out of proportion, just because I think the media has a way of doing that when it comes to almost anything. I mean, I was in crowds of people, and I never felt, it's a huge city at the same time. I was in Caracas the vast majority of my stay. It's a huge city, millions of people, skyscrapers, metro system. It's like any other giant city. Yeah.
Yeah, there's always going to be, any city has there's always going to be a part of town, or, maybe a lot of the town is going to be, there's going to be, crime elements. It just seems to be a thing that happens in big cities. People can get away easier and such. It's always a risk. And yeah, it's not just there, all throughout South America, there seems to be, there's problems with crime. Caracas is labeled a lot of times the world's most dangerous city. After you've labeled that multiple times, that's probably debatable, to be honest, because I'm pretty sure there's probably some cities in Africa that probably could rival that. I'm pretty sure Lagos is also really up there. And they're also, they're a city of like 20 million people, too. So, when it comes to, right, I think, because I see the way that a lot of South America has been going the last couple of years. Let's look. 2015, we had Macri won the election in Argentina. We had last year. I know Humala wasn't really exactly the most left-wing leaning, but he was more left than he was right. And now you have that's replaced by literally like an American that's called Peruvian. I mean, this guy lived in America for 30 years, Pablo Kuczynski, and worked in like American banking. Is now their president. You have in Paraguay, they went from Fernando Lugo to Mauricio Cortez, who is obviously right, center, very right-wing, which they also, that's for another part of the show maybe, but they have probably a bigger problem with crime and, violence in Paraguay than in Venezuela, but they don't talk about it because it happens in what is now an American ally, and maybe perhaps because it's a smaller country. And also, last but not least, is what we saw what happened in Brazil last year, about a year ago, when Michael Temer replaced Dilma Rousseff. You have a bad feeling that perhaps the Bolivarian Revolution, pink tide, whatever you want to call this left-wing swing in South America and away from American imperialism, do you have a bad feeling that ultimately South America is going to fall back into the Operation Condor years, or are you more optimistic for that? I try to remain optimistic, but, after the last couple of years, it's kind of grown a little bit weary on some of us people that are watching from afar.
I mean, I actually have the opposite experience. I think recently, in the last few years, 2 years in particular, there's been a setback in the pink tide, in the Bolivarian Revolution. I think there was definitely a setback. But if you look at the countries in which these setbacks occurred, in Argentina, Cristina Fernández de Kirchner just came first in the primaries in her Senate run in Buenos Aires. She's expected to take a seat in less than a month. And then she's expected, many believe, to run for president again in 2019. Lula in Brazil is the number one frontrunner for the Brazilian presidential election. Bolivia is still a socialist stronghold with Evo Morales. Nicaragua is still under the control of the Sandinistas. Uruguay is still left-wing. So even in the places where there were difficulties and setbacks, I think the people got a taste of this right-wing neoliberalism and quickly realize that it's time to go back. It's time to go back to Kirchner in Argentina. It's time to go back to Lula in Brazil, etc.
Yeah, it seems like that because quickly Macri, very quickly he's shown his ugly side. When he banned Telesur in his country, and there was already quickly economic problems inside of Argentina. I can tell that quickly. I honestly thought last year that Macri wouldn't even be in this long. I thought that he would have been removed from office by this point. Maybe he will make it through his entire term, but I think he won't survive the 2019 election, let's say, Tampa or Reagan.
Mm-hmm.
And in Brazil, well, that's the thing. You talk about Lula, but I remember, didn't they haven't they disqualified him from running next year, or they put charges on him that would make him not able to assume the presidency?
Yes, there is a pending investigation into Lula, just as there is against Cristina in Argentina. And I think it's funny how parallel these cases are. They're both such obviously bogus charges leveled against these two opposition leaders in Argentina and Brazil, against these two populist left-wing people. And, it's clearly a way to politically persecute these two leaders. They're seen as very charismatic. They're seen as the heart of the movement. And, it's a way to try to take them down. The United States has recently, they know how to pick their battles, that's for sure. They know that they can't, always go in guns blazing everywhere, like Iraq and Afghanistan, but they do things like the coup in Brazil against Dilma Rousseff, and now these charges against Lula. They do the same thing with Alberto Nisman in Argentina when he tried to bring a case against Cristina, and now these new cases against Cristina and many in her government. It's a quote-unquote legal way to implement a coup.
It's a political coup rather than what happened in 2002 in Venezuela, where they were very much exposed, and that ultimately failed for them. Chavez came back into power. Pedro Carmona was sent running, and made those perhaps one of the biggest mistakes. If there was any big mistakes made by the Chavez administration, was allowing these people to get away and not take it. Honestly, they should all have been charged with treason and should have been jailed for life. I would say for life. I don't think they deserve the quick death, to be honest. Because these people did lead to multiple Venezuelans being killed during that coup, or maybe perhaps the leader. But almost part of me wants to say that Pedro Carmona should have been sentenced to death and publicly executed just to send a message, but maybe it's a little too hardcore. And that would look pretty dictatorial. But I'm saying he's pretty much deserving of it. It's almost like, with Leopoldo Lopez, when they talk about he's only in jail for 13 years, what I say is that 13 years only for what he did. If he did that in America, he would have been sentenced to death most likely, or probably sent to Guantanamo and been tortured. Not that I support torture or anything like that, but I'm saying that's what would happen in the United States with the same charge, the same things that Leopoldo Lopez is responsible for. When it comes to across South America, yeah, they've definitely been more reserved in the way that they are doing this round, because in the past they were too obvious, and America had fingerprints all over when they threw out Salvador Allende, when they tried to throw out Hugo Chavez, and the multiple other disruptions that America has been involved in. And now they do it through political routes, through fake scandals. And they love to throw this term now, and they love to say that Russia was perpetuating fake news in the United States, but really America spreads fake news all around the world via CNN, via their different propaganda outlets, through Fox Latino and Voice of America Broadcasting. And that's actually the reason why I named the show Voice of Rebellion. It's kind of like a parody on Voice of America, because that was like the Cold War propaganda station for the United States that spread a lot of fake news around the world, try to paint America as the shining city on the hill, when ultimately, right now, any belief that America is any bit of a shining city is eroded any time there's a natural disaster, and you realize that our government doesn't give a shit about us, and how slow they are to roll out aid. You know, in a country that's supposedly as great as America, how bad they are at disaster recovery really shows where they're in, and also preparedness. You know, one thing that a lot of people were talking about prior to Irma and Harvey is that Cuba, a country that gets struck by many hurricanes, a lot more than I think than Florida does. They get struck like every year. They never seem to have mass casualties when these things come by, because they seem to actually care about people, and they do what it takes to keep these people alive. They don't really worry about property and all these other things that Americans seem to get preoccupied. You know, it's funny, every time they talk about the worst storms, it's usually by monetary damage, not by what actually the worst storm would be in American history, which was 1900 in Galveston, where 14,000 people pretty much drowned, I think, and when the entire city got flooded. I think that would qualify as the worst in American history. Not Sandy or Katrina was pretty bad, but wasn't as bad as Galveston. Moving on, though, what do you think about? Do you think there'll be another coup attempt in Venezuela? Do you think that perhaps America is going to make another attempt, or do you think there might be even a military intervention? Because our president right now seems to be pretty adamant about removing the Venezuelan government. This is actually one of the first things that he talked about, you know, when he became president, before he started this harsher rhetoric on North Korea and such. He started the really harsh rhetoric on Venezuela. Tillerson was talking about Venezuela before he was even inaugurated. And what do you think will happen in the Trump administration of Venezuela?
You know, that's one of the things about this administration. It's so unpredictable, especially in foreign policy, because Trump, you know, runs on one thing, says one thing, does another. But I think what we're seeing right now in Venezuela with these economic problems and, you know, this opposition and all that, I think is already an attempt at a non-traditional coup. So I think it's been something that they've been trying to do indirectly for many years. They just know they can't do it the traditional ways that they tried, you know, over a decade ago, that they did in, you know, the first time to Chavez, to what they did to Allende or Mossadegh in Iran. You know, they know that that's a little bit more obvious now. So they're doing more subversive ways, such as, you know, currency blocking and embargoes and financing opposition and promoting propagandic media outlets. So that's what they're doing now. They do it in Venezuela, in Ukraine. So I think they do it. They just do it a little differently now, and I think they're currently doing it to Venezuela.
Yeah. They're trying to hit them with the economic warfare. You know, what's kind of similar to is the situation that happened in Zimbabwe over the last few decades, is that, you know, ultimately a lot of what happened with the currency, they try to say it's on Mugabe's mismanagement. But it was really ultimately that they encircled them really badly over from the 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2 decades, until eventually their currency did crumble. They were partially successful. They got rid of their currency, and now they're forced to use foreign currency. But at the same time, Mugabe's still there, and it looks like that government's going to be there after Mugabe passed. Mugabe says he's running again the next year. I would think that he was retired in '94, but I guess he's going to go till he croaks. But it's kind of similar, and you know, it's even kind of a similar type of government in a way by their ideologies. That Zimbabwe is kind of like an African nationalist, Zimbabwe national socialist regime, not national socialist. Now, you know, they have left-wing nationalist elements. You know, that's a pretty strong left-wing nationalist element on the same time with socialist economic policy. And in Venezuela, it's pretty similar. You know, they have a pan-Latin belief, you know, with different left-wing Latin regimes. I think ultimately what Chavez's dream was, before he died, he tried to put in UNISUR, and he tried to put in Banco del Sur, these projects for a unified South America, all with socialist Colombia, every country that, and Colombia was actually the only government to not go left-wing over the last 20 years at one point or another. But I think he's hoping that even Colombia and Paraguay and all these countries would be unified together, and they would have a banking project, that probably would, it was kind of like their own BRICS, I think they were hoping for. And make collaboration between BRICS and banks of the sort. Because ultimately, you look at a lot of the pain, a lot of the punishment that the bankers and the people behind, the people that really are in control of the West, how they punish these countries through the economics, through the banking, through inflation, through tax on the currency, that kind of thing. Ultimately with a century of central banking also comes the century of economic warfare, the 20th century going into now. And that's what we're seeing in this modern world today, where a lot of the warfare is being done via computer screens, via accounts, via stuff of that nature. And a lot of the tension in the world that we see now, this could be really directly related, maybe not to oil, maybe not to any resource or any ideological split, but it's going to come down to economics. You said earlier in the show that they are having long lines at the banks and over a lack of cash. Now, explain how did that happen? I heard that they're having pretty serious problems with inflation, and I kind of know, was through dollar today and different ways of attacking the currency, they've been able to cause inflation. But elaborate a little bit more for me about it.
Well, I know a very big problem is the smuggling that happens with a lot of the currency that gets printed. The currency is printed overseas in Europe. It's one of the most high quality currency papers in the world. And the paper, many times, these bills, the bolivars, get smuggled into Colombia, into other countries, and they bleach the currency, and they use it for counterfeit dollars and counterfeit other currencies. I read an article from BBC that showed that 25 tons of Venezuelan currency was found in Uruguay by currency smugglers. That's just one of the avenues in which it's pursued, but that's a big part of the reason. That's a big part of the reason as to why there's such a problem with the currency in Venezuela. Think about that: 25 tons of currency, untold amounts, and then you have, Leopoldo Lopez's wife gets caught with hundreds of millions of bolivars in her car, in cases, and we're not supposed to think that's suspicious or anything.
So you say the currency is printed overseas in Europe, is what you're saying? Or do they get the paper from Europe? Or
it's actually printed overseas, and then it gets shipped.
Well, okay, I'm just going to ask, it does seem kind of weird. I did not know that. Why would they print the currency in Europe and not in Venezuela?
Well, that's actually how a lot of currencies operate, which I didn't know either until recently. But a lot of the currencies come from overseas, from currency printers in Germany and Switzerland.
And that kind of makes sense. Germany and Switzerland, especially Switzerland, they're kind of a country of banks, so they would have to be printing other countries' currencies. But what don't you think that Venezuela would work towards bringing it back home? Because it seems like a lot more secure way, to avoid smugglers. I just don't see why any country would trust any other country to host the printing of their most powerful asset, which is currency. Do you see any reason why Venezuela would still do that?
Well, I know it's just how it's been for a very long time. I'm sure they prefer how to do it, but I'm sure certain different contracts prevent them from doing that. I know they just announced new regulations for the currency in terms of new bills and hoping to transition from a cash-based economy into more of an electronic, debit-based economy. So they're definitely, they're trying to tackle this problem. It's just not as easy as it sounds sometimes, I guess.
Yeah, I know there's subtleties to governing that people might not realize exist, like contracts and stuff that are not easily revoked. I just found it kind of odd, because here's what comes to mind and me that is that I feel like a currency is something that should be totally to your own press in your own country, nationally owned, and then when you have international organizations do it, it kind of reminds me too much of like how the Federal Reserve works, that ultimately a few very powerful bankers, ultimately. But the ironic thing is that it's actually in Washington, D.C. They print it on behest of the Federal Reserve, but a few powerful bankers control the entire printing of our currency. Something that they don't sell too much is that our own currency is not owned by our government. It's owned by a private bank that calls itself federal, but ultimately by how it's owned and how it operates, it's dubiously public at best, you'd call it, but really it's, by how I see it, 100% private. But I understand Venezuela is a different situation because they're really dumping the dollar. They don't seem to have a lot of ties with Western economics too much, and they seem to be wanting to get rid of them. So it seems a little odd, but everything else goes more to along the lines. So yeah, still it's a minor detail. It's not really too much to be concerned about. In Venezuela,
I mean, half the world actually outsources their currency. Between 10 and 20% of all banknotes are printed by private companies, including companies in the UK, Canada, Germany, Sweden, even Massachusetts. Libya under Gaddafi printed Libya's currency from a British firm. Singapore outsources the printing of their currency. Finland, Sweden, Qatar, Bahrain, and India are also on the list. So it's not like a non-routine practice. Yeah.
Well, but sometimes in this world nowadays, the routine practices are kind of the things you have to look for because, a lot of the world is pretty effed up these days. These days are, not really even governments. They're more just they're puppets. They're puppets of bigger, much more powerful interests, like in the United States, that ultimately our government is really not what we see as our government's not really the end of it. Finally coming out, they're finally hearing the word deep state, which used to be what was called the shadow government, but when people mention the shadow government, they were conspiracy theorists. And, all these people that are unelected that hold high positions and they think things, and, that ultimately decide a lot of our foreign policy, like Council for Foreign Relations, Trilateral Commission, now are finally starting to get out there that these organizations exist and ultimately are pulling the strings in Washington, D.C. But that's why a lot of times people love to, a lot of people love to make it seem like it just became a problem recently. Or some people, they really think that everything just got fucked up with Donald Trump, and that since Donald Trump became presidency, now we need to worry about our government. But ultimately, Donald Trump's just a minor symptom of a disease that's been infecting our government for 100 years. Really since the bust of the Federal Reserve, I could say, is when America went out of control. We allowed a few billionaires, and some of these people not even from America, like the Rothschild family that have their stakes in the Federal Reserve, ultimately control our currency. To me, that's definitely when you cross the line, when you allow private banks to control your currency, and ultimately, they decide pretty much how our economy runs. In the end, they do things such as quantitative easing, such as artificial inflation, and they pretty much have our country by the balls right now. I want to change the subject a little bit. I want to ask you is that with all the propaganda that is against Venezuela right now, I see different organizations in North America. They try to counter that. But do you think there is any reasonable chance that maybe some of this propaganda can finally be reversed, and people, and there's any way they can bring people to actually understand the situation there better. Because sometimes it seems like you're just talking to a brick wall when you mention things such as Venezuela. They'll just bring every line that Tucker Carlson told you about Venezuela. So do you think there's any good ways you can think of, or any good lines and things that we can mention in order to try to reverse some of these misconceptions about Venezuela when we're talking to them?
I mean, I think people are already pretty distrustful of the media in general, but they seem to fall in line when it comes to foreign policy. You know, they seem to believe lies about other countries by the same media they distrust on everything else. So I think pointing that out, you know, the media, just pointing out the lies of the media in general, I mean, it's not hard to find the lies that they've been caught in. You know, and I think pointing out the fact that we've seen this before is also helpful. You know, we saw it with Iran, Afghanistan, Syria, Nicaragua. Like, we've just seen it with so many different countries before, and the playbook doesn't seem to have changed very much, you know, and just reminding people of how many conflicts all start the same and all are under the same pretenses and all end up to be false and all end up making the situation much, much worse if there was a problem even to begin with that wasn't lied about. I think we're getting into an age where people are becoming their own journalists in a way when it comes to social media. I think social media is a really great way to debunk a lot of these lies. You know, we have great journalists now like Abby Martin and Ava Bartlett, you know, who are exposing lies of the empire on many different fronts. And I think Twitter, Facebook, and, you know, different social media is just a great way to do that. You know, people are shying away from CNN and MSNBC and, you know, old forms of media, and they're going towards these new, more personalized methods. And I think, you know, we need to utilize that.
Yeah, social media, I think our government had a little bit of a role in making Facebook. I think it was one of the greatest tools for them, but we can make it a tool against them. You know, that it's great for them because they get, you know, everybody's selfies, they get everybody's information. You know, it's like a great database for people, you know, law enforcement and stuff to use often against us, but at the same time, we can maybe turn it on their head and ultimately use it to challenge the system, the status quo. It's very hard, you know. Actually, you know, reverse. It's like a wall we run into. Is that they don't believe the mainstream media on anything besides foreign policy. It seems like, and with they'll be so quick to, you know, defend. They'll be like, oh yeah, they're the fake news. You know, especially since the Trump administration started. It's actually pretty bizarre watching so many people, because our own media. It's a really weird game our media is playing. Is that they are claiming to be against the president, and they actually go nonstop talking about Donald Trump, CNN and MSNBC specifically, and even some of the Fox shows. But when it comes to foreign policy, whenever they start talking about foreign policy, then they're like, oh yeah, that's true, that country's doing that country's doing that. You know, in the 2016 election, I quickly picked up on that the foreign policy didn't seem to be things Americans were interested in. You know, like when Bernie Sanders, he lost any trust that I had in him, which was minuscule at best, because, you know, he was a candidate that had made it to that point. But when he started opening his mouth about how he thought Iran was a supporter of terrorism and North Korea was a major threat to the United States, and pushing the same lies, and also, you know, later on with that Russia stuff, Bernie Sanders was ultimately the sheepdog for Hillary the whole entire time, and was just another player, another pawn in the game, but really was no different. And also stuff about Israel, which, you know, some activists, I think, don't put a lot of emphasis on it. But to me, I mean, these people are forcing Palestinians to live in a concentration camp over there. They kill people that are trying to bring water to them. You know, remember the flotilla incident a couple of years ago. And I think that's probably the reason why they like Venezuela. A lot of media are so harsh on them, because they're one of the few countries in Venezuela that has called Israel out 100% for what they are, criminal, rogue, terrorist state that is involved, has their tentacles everywhere. It's not just in the Middle East our problem. Like Chavez said, they have people in Latin America. You know, they do false flags all around the world. They have the Mossad agents very similar to the CIA, but I would say the Mossad is almost a little bit more sneakier. They kind of fly under the radar because everyone's thinking about the CIA, but the Mossad's there, and they're a little bit more dirtier. They're the sneakiest, but Chavez actually. I remember that one speech he did, follow Israel, and he said, "Damn you, state of Israel." People started to say that Chavez is anti-Semitic or the Venezuelan government. They pushed that lie too a lot. That they're bigoted in this form, bigoted in that form, and I want to hear because you were down there, and I don't know you might have I don't know how much you actually walked around the general population, but one of the things I've seen is that the LGBT community apparently in Venezuela has tried to allege that the Maduro and the Chavez government is somehow hateful towards them. And so when you were walking around there, did you get the perception that might be the case?
I mean, I made a speech while I was there, and I mentioned LGBT people, and people loved it. People cheered and clapped, and they were completely supportive. I actually met a woman activist who was a lesbian who works in the oil sector, and she was fired under the government before Chavez. And, I think the emancipatory, the emancipation of the people under Chavez, it doesn't, under Chavez and Maduro, hasn't been exclusive to certain sexualities. I think when you get a president that is a socialist, when you get a president that's populist and cares about the people, I think it doesn't exclude gay, lesbian, bisexual, etc. people. In the United States, one of the biggest problems for the LGBT community is youth homelessness and youth unemployment and stuff like that. And, those problems don't exist as much for gay and lesbian people in Venezuela. Cuba just elected one of its first transgender lawmakers. I believe the Constituent Assembly in Venezuela either has a transgender constituent or a transgender constituent ran for the election. I think it's a different kind. I think the dynamics are different. I think, the struggle for marriage equality, for example, that was very important to people here for some reason in the United States. But that doesn't really do anything for gay people that are homeless, that are unemployed, that, don't have high enough wages, that don't have, decent health care. That doesn't do much for them if they're able to get married. In Cuba, for example, gay people can get free health care, whatever they need, but the importance on marriage just isn't there. So I think it may have something to do with almost a mistranslation between the countries.
Well, it's also that's actually kind of remarkable that they actually would be as accepting as they are. Is that they, it's also because a very traditional continent in some aspects, and stuff like that. Like LGBT rights sometimes is ignored, and school is kind of is down talked by a lot of the people, especially the older generations that are really traditional. The country is a continent that 90% of them are Catholic. But in fact, that Venezuela is that far ahead. They try to say it's so opposite. On I think like Univision, I think they were trying to say that that gays suffer massive harassment and stuff like that in the country. And it's unfortunate also because that's what a lot of the Latin community here, was talked about, like the Gusanos and also just the Latin community in general. People are not even from Venezuela or Cuba or Nicaragua countries because they get their news from Univision, which that's what a lot of Spanish speakers of the country watch for their news, and it's like their only news station here in America for Spanish speakers in many places. And ultimately, they're owned by Telemex, which is owned by Carlos Slim, the richest guy in Mexico. One thing that should be realized is that ultimately even if they're from different countries, the elites of the world, the billionaires and bankers and nobility and stuff like that, are usually on the same page, and usually they're very unified. That's the problem. That's one of the major problems in the world, really, is that the people such as that, the ultra rich, the bankers, your politicians, your businessmen, they're unified. And while we, people, we argue amongst ourselves by tricks that they pull on us, like the two-party paradigm. How many Americans don't get along, and how many families sometimes don't even get along over politics that are a show? Is that you have half the families Democrats and half the families Republicans, and they're ultimately never going to have a political conversation because they're already, on two different sides. They're on two different gangs of the American criminal political system, and they never can start talking about, hey, I think this is kind of messed up how, so many people are living homeless now in America. We have, since 1996 to 2006, in that 20-year span, so only 2 decades, we had people that lived under $2 a day or less went quadruple. It went up by 400%. So, or 300%, maybe. So that's the kind of things that are not talked about because we can't even have political conversations. We're so divided. And ultimately, people just have conversations and look past division. They also try to, right now, they're really trying to stoke the flames of a racial war, I think, in this country. They're really loving to push this black-white divide right now. And, of course, some of the stuff that they say in the media about, how blacks are treated is true, but I think they're not doing it because they actually have good intentions. They're doing it because they want, ultimately, to put this two different, major, they have this, like, Black Lives Matter versus the Patriots, people like people for the branch and all that. They try to divide up even the activist community in America. They divide everywhere they can see they can divide between black and white versus female, male. Look at you've seen these people, these women that have went way over, being what you guys even call feminists. These people are, they deserve the term feminazi. The people that pretty much blame men for everything. And that's what they have pushed on that front, and then they have men, and then some men with a natural reaction, I guess, have made an opposite, and it just divides everybody. And the media has caused this. They are pushing this, they're propagating this on and even how it's set up. CNN is like your centrist. You got MSNBC, one extreme, and Fox on the other extreme, and they're the butt heads at each other while the rich continue to, and by the rich, I mean the ultra rich, not the guy that has the kind of nice house down the street. I'm talking about the guy that lives in a 100-room mansion in Cayman Islands with, 100 or million or $1 billion of wealth. These are the kind of people that I'm talking about. I'm talking about the ultra rich. So you're pretty young, right? You're about 20, 21. You said you're in school.
I'm 19, yeah.
Oh, so you're the same age as me. Okay, cool. So you think that in this generation, talk about here in the United States, do you think that there might be potential that we might see some bigger changes because maybe perhaps our generation thinks a little bit differently than past generation?
I think definitely. I think with this new generation, our generation, I think there's a break from the tradition, and that's either a very good thing or a very bad thing. I think people our age tend to either be attracted to the far right or the far left. I think people our age also tend to reject the two-party dictatorship, which again is a good thing. But I think there's, the potential for it to be co-opted by right-wing forces, fascist forces, alt-right forces. And I think that needs to be combated. I think the left needs to kind of reinvent itself almost and kind of capture this anger and this discontent that many people, not only our generation, but also every other generation, are feeling. Because people are obviously upset. They just can't quite put their finger on what the problems are in this country. So I think, people are either going to go very right or very left, and I hope it's the latter.
Well, don't you think that some of the reasons why some of the people have went to the right wing is because ultimately they do talk sometimes, they do speak to the working class a lot of times, and to, your average working class little white person in America, while the left seem to have ignored a lot of the rural Americans. A lot of, I'm talking about a lot of your college leftists. They seem to ignore and sometimes even belittle the poor white working class that makes up the biggest demographic in America. Ultimately, it's, by acknowledging them doesn't say that we are thinking that they're superior, but some of the college leftists like to believe that for some reason. I think it's making the left fracture and sending a lot of those people that could be potentially on the left right into the hands of people that will acknowledge and eventually will tell them that they're superior on the far right. Your people like David Duke and stuff like that. That ultimately, whether you want to acknowledge it or not, are populist, and they have a quite a different intention. And ultimately, I think some of them are also tools for the elite. I think they're just kind of like how I think that some of these people, again, a lot of the polarizing figures. It's like you have on the one side you all right, and then you have the other side. Some of your social justice warriors or whatever you want to call them. And what I mean by that, people that are only concerned with identity politics, that they're more concerned about having, really, they don't know anything about economics. They don't know about anything about. They might even call themselves a socialist, but no knowledge of socialist ideology, different difference between Marxism, Leninism versus Titoism versus just general left-wing nationalism, market socialism. They don't know any of that stuff. Don't you think that some of the problems of why a lot of people are going to the right is from the left's own mishandling of its image?
Oh, absolutely. I think the left has long ago kind of stopped talking about class analysis and kind of started to neglect the problems that used to be our bread and butter problems, unemployment, homelessness, poverty, wage suppression, etc. I think, we've been co-opted by liberalism, and our focus is no longer on emancipating the working class. It's no longer on liberating the working class and overturning the oligarchy and the ruling elite. It's now, just BS infighting and issues that, one, the working class can't rally around, and two, you just can't win anything running on a platform of. You just can't win an election, you can't win a revolution, you can't win, votes or hearts, minds, anything by running on a platform of gay marriage. You just can't. But people care about the issues that affect them every single day. People care about the fact that, they can't pay their rent, they can't get decent medical attention, they can't pay for their children's education. These are the issues that the left used to rally around, this populist, people's power-oriented messaging. And that's no longer how it is. And the right wing, seeing a window, has come in and co-opted our messaging and has been talking to the working class people and using, black people, Latino people, immigrants, refugees, Muslims, etc., as a scapegoat for these problems that are really caused by the oligarchy and capitalism. And the left really hasn't challenged that, it seems.
Well, don't you think also another part, though, of the left's problem in modern-day America is that I think a lot of them dwell too much and they're talking about these people that, to the eyes of Americans and to the eyes of me, I've seen a lot of research, I've seen stuff that I support, countries like Venezuela and Syria, Russia, but I don't support, like happened in the Soviet Union in the 1930s, 1940s under Stalin. When these people are talking about how, they like Stalin and they like Mao Zedong, that's going to turn off most Americans, because even if you bring a lot of evidence, it's been heavily programmed to these people that these were, bad leaders. And ultimately there is. I mean, it doesn't look like, to me. It looks like these were definitely, at the very least, called degenerative worker state. Stalin, I don't even really consider typical socialist. I would say he's just sort of he was more of just a strong man that ultimately did what he did for his power. He pretty much killed most people in his party, and I kind of find Russia to be interesting. All that history around 1917, the Bolsheviks, to be pretty interesting. There's some anomalies, I guess you could say, inside the people that were in that first Soviet government. But don't you think that by talking about supporting, a lot of the people like on Facebook, you talk about how people become their own journalists, and if you want to put out information about, stuff that's going on present day, maybe we shouldn't be glorifying past socialist leaders that are seen as failed.
I mean, I think it's important that we, correct people where they're wrong and are honest about how we feel and stuff like that. But I do think, it's time to move on, I guess. I think Chavez's ideology of Bolivarianism and socialism for the 21st century, I think that's a very interesting idea, because obviously I think the messaging and a lot of the theory and such has to be updated and modernized, and has to kind of roll with the times and be contextualized, as opposed to just kind of staying where it's been for all this time, which is another reason why I'm so interested in the Bolivarian process.
Well, look at you're talking about modernizing the approach. Look, that's one of the things that the far right's been very successful at. They've gained a lot of supporters online via their meme game, I guess you could say, and stuff like that. They bring the dankest memes, like in quotation, which some of it's only funny, I guess, if you're kind of racist, but the far right has definitely been able to approach the younger generation and been pretty successful at it, and also came with a mask. A lot of people don't even realize they've been sucked into the depths of fascism and such when they by the things that they're supporting now. And that's, I think the far right kind of seem like the counterculture, and that's how it's been explained by some people. It's been explained. I even think that's what Milo Yiannopoulos, not support him in any way, but I'm saying that's what he said in his own words. That's actually pretty true, is that they've been able to market themselves as something different, something edgy, and something cool. It's like, hey, you can be, are you tired of being around all those lame social justice warriors that are in your generation? It's like, hey, you can be cool and you can be different. You can be with us, the alt-right. You can be here. You can put Pepe memes and talk about, call everyone a cuck that doesn't agree with you. It really, that's what it seems like. It's not really these people are even in an ideology. It's more that these people have just found a group, a niche to get into, and it's like a big hobby almost for these people, a lot of them that came in there. But I think that's been one of their major successes. It's been modernization of their approach, and you see how they don't talk about like Hitler and Mussolini and stuff like that, because they did that. Of course, Americans, a lot of these young people would have never been sucked into it, but they try to market it as something different. They'll say as anti-communism is one of the things that they love to, and that's throughout history, going back to the 70s and 80s. In the Cold War, fascists a lot of times like to market themselves as purely just anti-communist in order to gain popular support and put this fear out there that there's this big communist threat. They love these people on the far right often love to try to say that our government has somehow became communist Marxist of some sort, and that our system is becoming increasingly socialist. You did talk about earlier how you are going to school on tens of thousands of dollars of grants. This is often the kind of thing that people on the right wing try to point at to say that this is socialism at work and that we're becoming a socialist country. How would you point out the difference between the social programs that we have in the United States, federal grants, that kind of thing, between a socialist country?
Yeah, going to school in New York, being in New York City in general, kind of helps me feel vindicated as someone on the left simply because of how expensive it is. I mean, I don't know. There's a book that was written years and years ago called Cities Without Crisis, and it talks about different aspects of the Soviet Union compared to the United States, and how rent wasn't allowed to be, more than a certain part of your income, how education was free, and it just talks about everything. And New York City is such the embodiment of modern-day capitalism, such splendor and squalid people and, such luxury alongside homelessness and poverty and unemployment and, all these other social ills. It's, in some parts of certain places have graduation, like high schools have graduation rates of like 6%. People going to school being like 16. There was a certain school in a certain part of New York where I can't remember it off the top of my head, but people going into this high school, only about 11% of them were proficient in reading, and only about 6% were proficient in math. It's a tale of two cities that the mayor we have now campaigned on fixing the last election, but obviously, I don't think many people, actually I do think many people believed him, simply because this is a Democratic city, and it's a Democratic mayor, but obviously that hasn't happened. It's only gotten worse. It's really amazing what could be done if we did good things with the wealth that we produce. New York City alone has billions of dollars of economic activity every year. And if we use that for housing and healthcare and education and jobs programs and job training and childcare, it's really amazing. The school I go to is $60,000 a semester. I could never pay that, and I don't pay that. Rents here, you pay $2,000 for a room in an apartment. It's not just New York City. It's not just urban centers. Across rural places, all across in Pennsylvania, population is 2,000 people. Unemployment is very high. The opioid crisis is only getting worse. Housing is still inaccessible for many, many people, as is education. These problems might be more apparent in certain places, but this entire country is affected by it.
Well, yeah, I'll ask you something. In that town you came from, I'm going to guess that the demographics are probably about 85% or higher white. Am I right?
Well, where I'm from specifically, I'm from a small town that's right outside of, I live in the Lehigh Valley in Pennsylvania, and where I'm from specifically is very small, but very close by, there's huge centers of Hispanic communities and Black communities. So it's not entirely homogenous, but in the very, very small area that I live in, yes, but in the wider area, no, if that makes sense.
Well, still, if that in that town specifically, and towns probably like it, that's a lot of America lives in these little towns, where I actually just went to when I was evacuating from the hurricane. I went to where my grandparents live in a small town in Tennessee. I'm pretty sure it's probably kind of a similar thing to what you grew up in Pennsylvania. That's what I was saying earlier, is that they're suffering. They're suffering. They're in Crossville, Tennessee, where they have massive problem with the opiate crisis as well. They have a huge problem there. People are very poor. They make very. There's not a lot of jobs, really. I think people do have jobs. They don't get paid too badly, but there's just not a lot of them available. That's, like I was saying, is that the left has ignored a lot of these people that are in the heart of America, that are living in towns of 3,000 people and are suffering badly. And that's ultimately why people of a lot of the right-wing people have been able to co-opt people that are struggling in these cities. They're like, well, the left has never talked about me, but these guys, well, they seem to actually care about me. And, even you look at his elections kind of telling, Trump went to a lot of these little tiny small towns all across the heart of America. He did not stop campaigning practically. And he's still doing rallies in pretty remotely, pretty small towns. Some of these places that he went to since becoming president. That's how he's been able to keep some of the supporters, and ultimately, I think that's why a lot of the interior of the country, because the right wing pays attention, but ultimately they don't realize that they don't have their really best interests at heart. Ultimately, they still want to continue the same economic system that's kept them in these gutters of cities that they live in. I mean, come on, the entire Appalachia, practically, places in Tennessee, West Virginia, they don't even have jobs. They don't exist. Every single job practically has moved out and went to Mexico, went to China, went to other countries. And I think that's there's two things that need to be implemented, any kind of, and they've been implemented in Venezuela. And that's why I like what Venezuela did. Is that they have a populist social system, definitely, and there's nationalism. You can't have these people, a lot of these people on the left that try to make it seem like the very concept of the United States of America is wrong. The people are very patriotic in this country. I consider myself to be a patriot, and that's why I do what I do in order to try to hopefully see my country that I love, change and stop being taken advantage of by these people at the top and the government that we have. I mean, siphoned off, and the people's wealth and the people's production has been stolen from for a very long time. That's very critical. The rejection of ultra right-wing nationalism is different from the rejection of nationalism as a whole. The rejection of nationalism as a whole, I believe, is wrong. That's why I think that the reason why Venezuela has been able to make it this long and hasn't been overthrown the coup yet is because they have nationalism. People are proud to be Venezuelan and are prouder than ever to be Venezuelan under the current government there. I think that's very important. But by the way, I was just going to note that we got 10 minutes left of the regular show before we go into the studio hour. This is what's going to cut on UCY.TV the first 2 hours. That's all I have the time slot for is 9 p.m. to 11 o'clock Eastern Time. So if you haven't, by the way, everyone's listening out there, if you haven't caught part of the show, just tuned in, last 5 minutes, 10 minutes, you can catch the rest of it at UCY.TV, 9 o'clock Eastern. And also we put every show that we do on UCY.TV on YouTube. So later that night, you just have to look up Voice of Gun Radio on YouTube and pop up right there. Every show that I've done in the last 2 years is on there for the most part. But since we're running out of time, I just want to thank you, Dakotah, for coming on a short notice. And it's been a pleasure to talking to you. Also, just your whole story about going to Venezuela has been pretty cool to hear about. I didn't even get to the point. I mentioned his name earlier, but you went on that Tucker Carlson show. How long ago was that? Was that like 3 or 4 months ago, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was in May, I believe.
Yeah. When you were on that show, I mean, I'd imagine just being in the same building, as Fox News, being there with a Fox News reporter. Did you feel like you were like an alien in there? I mean, how was the whole feeling, the whole sentiment of being inside of a new studio?
I mean, it was definitely interesting. I mean, I'd never been in one of the, like Midtown New York City huge skyscraper buildings before. They came down and got me. It was very interesting. I mean, I was there for probably a total of like 40 minutes. I went in, I did my spiel, I left. But, I mean, when you're debating someone who just doesn't seem to understand what you're saying or just keeps ignoring what you're saying and talking about something, like, it was very infuriating. Looking back on it, I really don't know how I stayed so calm. I think that's one of the only areas in my life where I've ever remained calm in a situation like that. I guess it paid off. But it was surreal, really. I mean, looking back, I'm still not sure how it happened.
I don't know. I feel like to be honest, with the crowd though at the Fox News crowd. There was no way you were going to sway them either way. But yeah, because I remember looking through the comments and they're like, "Oh, this guy's like, look at, he has no soul in his eyes. He's emotionless or whatever." It's like, see, they'll just point anything out. But I feel like if you went the other way, they'd be like, "Oh, look at this crybaby liberal libtard snowflake making an uproar." So I feel like either way you went with that, it wasn't going to change the minds of these people. Are so they're on one side. They're on over there on the right wing side of the left to right coin of America. It'd be the same thing like if I was to go on Rachel Maddow's show or something like that and talk about how Russia is not influencing our elections and how it's actually the Israeli government has a lot more influence over our politics. It doesn't matter what I would say, no matter which approach I did it. Ultimately, in the end, they'd be calling me an alt-right neo-Nazi or something like that. And because even if I said everything else, just for bringing up, for going against their belief on that, which I didn't even ask you about that, but I wanted to hear, because a lot of the people on the left now, they might be supportive actually of some of the South American governments, but they still hold on to this idea that Russia is some kind of far-right authoritarian government. What do you think about them?
I mean, I think they're wrong. I think the United States I think Russia had absolutely nothing to do with the election of Donald Trump. I don't think there was any sort of election tampering. I don't think Russia, it's just so absurd, honestly. I think a lot of the establishment is just upset with Russia because Russia, again, is leading this whole, BRIC initiative, is leading in, countering the petrodollar in oil trades. They're not allowing the Ukraine to become a proxy of Western Nazism, which again I think irritates a lot of people. I think Russia's just kind of this punching bag. I think a lot of it also has to do with xenophobia, honestly. I think it's just a way for liberals to feel fine with being xenophobic just because it's Russia.
Well, yeah, you see all of these, sometimes even the liberals will say stuff that is, if it was about any other culture, would be probably deemed as racist to them, but because it's Russia, it's fine. It's straight out, it's straight out xenophobia that they are believe in when it comes to Russia. And yeah, it's very unfortunate. I think it has everything to do with they ultimately are the ones that they're the biggest country that opposes the Western game, and they are the ones that are leading BRICS. They're leading a lot of the major initiatives, really to bring down the current over here in the Western countries, the United States, the United Kingdom, and they might be the only country that can really do anything about the United States and really actually challenge, if it ever came down to it militarily, every single Western power. There's no Western power that could probably take down the might of the Russian military. So it really upsets them, and they try anything to try to take them out via illegitimate means. And yeah, it's funny that they really talk about how they try to say that Russia's behind the far right in Europe emerging. It's funny because the United States was tolerant of the far right in Ukraine in 2014 when they did Euromaidan. It's funny because a few years before that they were warning about it. The European Union put a warning label on Svoboda, one of the parties that took over along with Reichstag. Now these fascist parties are openly tolerated by the United States government and Western governments alike. Even the German government with their own history. Merkel supports the Euromaidan government, which has tracked down ethnic Russians. They have killed, they're responsible, I would say, for 10,000 deaths at least already in Ukraine during this brutal civil war. One of my major causes is the plight of the people in eastern Ukraine. And, I brought on the guy, Sergei Bartashov, who runs the Novorossiya Humanitarian Battalion in Ireland, UK, which is like a branch off from the original Novorossiya Humanitarian Battalion. But pretty much now they are like one of the biggest humanitarian groups that's helping the people of Ukraine. Had him on a couple shows. Very interesting, that whole situation. Sometimes they'll even say the Russians are when they're battling the real fascists. These people literally consider Stefan Bandera, a Nazi collaborator, to be a hero. They carry around pictures of Adolf Hitler and the Azov Battalion. They carry around swastika flags and such. There was a picture actually that was famous where they had a NATO flag, a Ukrainian flag, and a Nazi flag